All right, let's talk about performance in a multi-engine airplane, specifically a light twin. We're going to have some new distances that we did not have in a single engine airplane. We're going to have our first distance that we're going to talk about is going to be our accelerate and stop distance. This is the horizontal distance that we will need to be stopped on the runway, accelerate to rotation speed, lose an engine at rotation speed, abort the takeoff, and come to a stop on the runway. Legally, we are not required to take off on a runway that is as long as our accelerate and stop distance. However, it's probably good practice too. The next distance we are going to talk about is our accelerate and go distance. This is the horizontal distance needed to be stopped on the runway, accelerate to rotation speed, lose an engine at rotation speed, continue our takeoff, and climb over a 50-foot obstacle. Now, most light twins will not have an accelerate and go distance. It's good practice to not continue a takeoff on one engine in a light twin. The very large majority of light twins are not going to have the performance to be able to continue a takeoff on one engine. That brings us to our engine failure briefing of what are we going to do right before what are we going to say right before we take the runway as part of our engine failure briefing. So we're going to break it down into three parts. Engine failure on the runway, we're just going to abort the takeoff, close the throttles, maintain directional control on the runway, and bring the airplane to a stop. Engine failure after takeoff with the gear down, we're not going to try and keep flying. We're just going to pick the best spot in front of us and land the airplane. And then engine failure after takeoff with the gear up, we are going to continue flying, run what we call the drill, which is our engine failure flow to get an engine feathered in a multi-engine airplane, and attempt to make it back to a runway to land the airplane. Now we'll talk a little bit later that there are going to be some exceptions to that, but that's going to be our rule of thumb emergency briefing for takeoff. Along with the new distances we also have some new speeds in multi-engine airplanes. We have our VYSE speed. That is our best single engine rate of climb. It is also our least rate of descent. That is the speed that will have the airplane descending the slowest if we are above, or at the lowest rate if we are above our absolute single engine absolute ceiling. And we'll talk about what that is here in just a minute. We have our VXSE, which is our single engine best angle of climb. Now, our VYSE, single engine best rate of climb, is marked on the airspeed indicator with a blue radial line. Our VXSE, our best angle of climb, is not marked on the airspeed indicator. And then we have our VMC speed, which is marked by a red radial line on the airspeed indicator. And we'll get into what VMC is on another lesson and talk all about it. All right, a couple new terms we have, a couple new altitudes. One I just mentioned, our single engine absolute ceiling. That is the highest the airplane can fly on one engine. Unlikely we would ever be able to actually climb to that altitude. How we are actually going to reach that altitude is it's also what's called our drift down altitude. So that is the altitude that the airplane will come down to if you are above that altitude and you lose an engine. We also have our single engine service ceiling, which is the highest the airplane can maintain a 50-foot per minute climb. Those distances that I talked about and those two altitudes that I just talked about, so single engine absolute ceiling, single engine service ceiling, we'll use our single engine climb performance charts to find those distances, and our accelerate and stop distance and our accelerate and go distance, if the airplane has that, those will both be figured out using charts in the airplane's POH. Now let's talk about what happens if we lose an engine. So in a multi-engine airplane, if we lose an engine, we will lose 50% of our thrust. However, we lose 80 to 90% of our performance. That's a rough estimate, but that's kind of the textbook answer. We lose 80 to 90% of our performance, and we can prove that very easily. If we take our climb performance charts, we'll have two climb performance charts in the POH, one for multi-engine rate of climb and one for single engine rate of climb. If we figure out that single engine rate of climb take that number and divide it by our multi-engine rate of climb, we will be left with about 10 to 20% of our performance remaining, meaning we lost 80 to 90% of that performance. Now let's talk about when that loss of performance most affects us. Straight and level flight on a single engine, especially if you are below your single engine absolute ceiling, or coming into land or on an instrument approach on a single engine, as long as you have control of the airplane, what you will find is it's not very challenging to do. The airplane can fly pretty well with a feathered prop, especially if it's trying to descend. So that loss of performance we just talked about, when does that affect us? It affects us anytime we are trying to climb. So common times we need to climb in an airplane: takeoff, climbing out, climbing to avoid terrain. Two times that are associated with a landing, trying to go around or trying to do a missed approach. Those are the instances where that loss of performance is going to greatly affect us in a multi-engine airplane. In a light twin, a lot of times you'll find that your best rate of climb on a single engine is only about 100 or 200 feet per minute, well below what you need to execute a missed approach procedure if you're flying an instrument approach. And if it's VFR conditions and you were to try to go around at that rate of climb, at 100 feet per minute, it's going to take you 10 minutes to climb to pattern altitude on a single engine. So as a general rule of thumb, in a light twin, there are no missed approaches, no go arounds. If you are on a single engine and you're coming into land, you are committed to land. And it would be a very rare scenario that you would ever consider a go around or a missed approach. Probably safer to come in and land than to try to go missed or execute a missed approach. All right, so let's talk about some scenarios. So first scenario that we'll talk about, we'll actually talk about a missed approach. So if we are coming in on an instrument approach and we are in IMC and we have lost an engine, and say we figured that we can get a 200 foot per minute rate of climb on a single engine. Well, the minimum climb gradient that we need to meet to fly a missed approach for IFR flying is 200 feet per nautical mile. If a light twin, just as a rough estimate, if it's covering 1.5 miles per minute over the ground, that means we're flying 90 miles an hour. We need a rate of climb of 300 feet per minute to be able to fly a missed approach. So if we figured our rate of climb is only 200 feet per minute, we cannot guarantee obstacle clearance if we try and execute that missed approach procedure. So that is why it goes back to what I was saying. As a general rule of thumb, there are no missed approaches on a single engine. We're committed to landing. Even if you're in IMC conditions and you get down to minimums and you do not have the runway in sight, you're going to just go ahead and land the airplane, because it is safer to continue on down knowing that a runway is there than to try to go missed, potentially hitting obstacles or terrain. The next scenario we'll talk about is taking off from high density altitude airports. We'll take the twin Comanche as an example airplane. If we're at max gross weight in a twin Comanche, a PA-30, our single engine absolute ceiling is 7,000 feet in density altitude. So let's pretend that we're taking off at Flagstaff Airport on a hot summer day. Density altitude can easily reach 10,000 feet. So if our single engine absolute ceiling is 7,000 feet and the airport that we are taking off of has a density altitude of 10,000 feet, the airport we are taking off out of is already above our single engine absolute ceiling. So back to our engine failure takeoff scenario that we talked about a few minutes ago. Engine failure on the runway, we're going to pull the throttle to idle and stop. After takeoff, gear down, we're going to land straight ahead. After takeoff, gear up, we're going to hopefully continue flying. If we're taking off out of a high density altitude airport and we are already above our single engine absolute ceiling, continuing that takeoff might not be possible even if the gear is up. The reason being is because we might already be higher than the highest the airplane can fly on a single engine, and we might immediately begin descending even if we are flying the airplane perfectly. So it's something to consider when we are taking off out of high density altitude airports in a light twin, we might have to come up with a different plan depending on the altitude that we actually lose that engine at. Another scenario, kind of similar, is if we are taking off towards rising terrain. Scottsdale Airport, KSDL, if we're taking off runway 3, is a great example of this. We have a 4,000 foot mountain out in front of us, and we're taking off from 1,500 feet. If we start that climb out and we lose an engine just after takeoff with the gear up, we're not going to outclimb a 4,000 foot mountain on a single engine. It's only about 4 miles away from the end of the runway. We also don't want to necessarily turn that low to the ground. If we just brought the gear up and we're only 100 or 200 feet AGL off the ground, we're only going to get that climb performance if we're flying the airplane perfectly. So if we start turning, we're going to lose that lift, and we potentially might descend. So taking off out of airports with obstacles around the airport or in our flight path, again, we might have to come up with a different plan depending on when we lose that engine. Might need to start looking for a place to land, even if we have brought the landing gear up and ideally would like to continue flying. Last thing we're going to talk about as it relates to single engine performance is our zero side slip. So zero side slip is a performance concept, and it's the proper way that we want to fly the airplane when we are on a single engine. Now, the only way we would know that we are exactly in zero side slip would be to have a yaw string on the airplane, which we probably don't have. So the manufacturers have come up with a bank and rudder coordination that they have determined gives us the best performance when we are flying the airplane on a single engine. You're going to have to look in the POH of the specific airplane that you are flying to determine what zero side slip is. In the Twin Comanche, it is 5 degrees of bank and a half ball rudder deflection towards the operative engine. So if our left engine is inoperative, we would bank 5 degrees to the right, and we would deflect that rudder or the ball halfway towards that right engine. The Seminole, for example, 2 to 3 degrees of bank and a half ball rudder deflection. So again, you're going to need to look up in the POH what the specific combination of bank and rudder is to know how to fly the airplane properly on one engine. If we tried to use only rudder to keep the airplane flying straight ahead, we could do that. However, we are going to be slipping into the wind. The wind's going to be hitting us. The relative wind is going to be hitting us at an angle, creating more drag, reducing our performance. Same thing if we were to only use bank to keep the airplane flying straight ahead on a single engine, we would be also slipping into the wind and creating drag, which would reduce our performance. That's it for single engine performance. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments or email me, and I'd be happy to answer them.